I made $93,018 from this self-storage facility without any of my own money. I'm going to break it down step by step and show you how I did it so you can go and repeat the same steps and make money too. And make sure you watch to the end where I'll break down my gold nugget tip on how to find these buyers that can buy these $1 million properties. So first, let's start off, how did I even find this deal? Well, I cold called the seller and asked him if he wanted to sell. What cold calling is when you find the phone number of a seller or an owner of a property and you call them out of the blue and ask them if they wanted to sell, even when they're not actively looking to sell. But how did I even find that phone number to begin with? It all comes down to data. Data is the most important tool to getting these motivated leads. So where I found this data was I went to my local county tax assessor's office and asked for a list of tax delinquent properties. That's basically a list of properties in the county that are behind on the property taxes. If they're behind on the property taxes, they're probably more likely to sell at a discount. So once I got the list, I scrubbed it down so that I only pulled out the commercial properties from the list, as that list would normally include all types of properties from houses, mobile homes, vacant lots, offices. So I just pulled out all the commercial properties and I contacted that list. How you can tell if it's a commercial property or not is by the class code of the property. Here in Texas, commercial properties have the class code F1. So I filter out all the properties by class code and only copy and paste the ones that have F1 into a separate file, and that's how I have my commercial only list. So this tax delinquent file will have the owner's name, their mailing address, and the property address. And these three things are all the information you need to skip trace to find the phone numbers. Skip tracing is basically where you upload a file with this information and a system or software will pull the known phone numbers associated with that name and address. It's usually about a 70% hit or miss rate where it's going to be the correct number 70% of the time. So just be prepared for wrong numbers. So with commercial properties, a lot of times the title is held under an LLC. So you need a skip tracing company that can search LLCs to find the owner's name and phone number. Several skip trace providers do this. Just Google and make sure that they can do LLCs. I know Batch Skip Tracing and Lead Sherpa can do this. I'm not affiliated with either of those, but I'm just giving you examples of skip tracing companies that can do LLCs. Once the company skip traces the list, they'll send you back an Excel file with phone numbers and emails that you can contact. What you want to do is you just want to clean up the first one or two phone numbers, as normally that's the right number over 90% of the time. Once you have these phone numbers, you can cold call or text these sellers. What I do is I upload the list to a dialer, which is a software that lets you dial multiple phone numbers at a time so you can go through the list faster. And I have my VA or virtual assistant do the calling. But for most of you, if you're just starting out, you'll be the one doing the cold calling. I know it sucks, but you're going to be the best one to market yourself and try to get a deal. So the next step is negotiating the deal. Once my virtual assistant got in contact with the seller, he just asked very basic preliminary questions, such as, what purchase price are you looking for? How many units are there? What's the unit mix? How much rent are you pulling in right now? And then I can do a preliminary analysis on the property to see if it's even worth my time. So what happened for this property is the seller gave him all that information, and when I crunched the numbers, it looked like a deal. So let me break it down for you. This self-storage facility was just north of Houston, Texas, and it was 235 units. The seller was asking for $1.2 million. He had owned it for over 30 years and has rented it by himself and being self-managed. The first thing I did was I Googled that area and looked at what other self-storages in that area were charging. The majority of the units at the property were 10 foot by 10 foot storage spaces. That's probably the most common size for self-storage units. And I was able to see that he was only charging $65 a month for his 10 by 10 units. When I did my market analysis and I looked up the other self-storage facilities in the area, they were all charging anywhere from $90 to $100 for the same sized unit. A $30 to $35 increase doesn't sound like a whole lot, but considering that's over a 50% increase considering his current income, that's a huge difference, especially in commercial real estate where the property is valued based on the income and expenses of the property. If you can increase the income by 50%, you increase the value of the property by 50%. So this was a huge value add opportunity that I knew was at this property. This was actually my first self-storage deal, so I wasn't too familiar on how to analyze the deal, but I followed the basic rules and principles of real estate. One is price per door or price per unit, and two is the 1% rule. I took his asking price of $1.2 million and divided it by the number of units, 235 units. This gave me a price per unit of around $5,000, which is very cheap. Next, I applied the 1% rule to analyze the property. Basically, the 1% rule means the gross monthly rent, if you divide it by 1%, that should be the price you're paying for the property. This rule is more common in multifamily rentals, but I just applied it to self-storage as well, just to get a general rule of thumb before I decide whether or not to analyze it even more. The gross current rents that the property is bringing in monthly, when I divided it by the 1% rule, it came out to 1.4 million. Considering its asking price was 1.2 million, which is below the 1% rule, I knew this is probably going to be a deal, so I analyzed it further. The last thing that really sold the deal was that the property came with 2 extra acres in the back of the property. That was extra land you could expand and add more units on. Once I crunched my numbers and analyzed the deal, I figured it would be worth $2.2 million if it was brought up to market rents and ran properly. How I got this number was 1, I raised the rents to the market rents of the competitors. 2, I assumed a 70% occupancy, as self-storage tends to have more vacancies than multifamily. And 3, I assumed a 30% expense ratio, as self-storage doesn't really have that many expenses. Once I had those items, I had the NOI, or net operating income. I took that NOI and I divided it by a cap rate of 7%, just to be conservative, as I know self-storage isn't as low of cap rates as multifamily. Doing all that math got me to the end number of 2.2 million. Now, granted, the property did need a little bit of work, but it was mainly just management improvements and raising the rents. So once I knew it was going to be a deal, I then called the seller back and asked him if the price was negotiable. You always want to try to negotiate the price even if it's already a deal. However, it was not, as his brother, who was also an owner of the property, said he had a hedge fund buyer out of New York ready to buy the property. So I was competing with a buyer that was out of state and that could pay more. So the next thing I did is I told him, okay, that's fine, but let me just go out and walk the property and confirm it's in good condition. So I went out and walked the property and it was in great shape. The only thing is several buildings had flooded before in a prior hurricane. The reason I really liked the deal, beside the low rent, was 1, it was fully fenced in. 2, there was extra land to build on. 3, the buildings themselves were in great shape and built in the late 90s and early 2000s. 4, it was right off a major freeway with potential and great visibility. And 5, it was fully paved with concrete everywhere between the buildings. These are all small things that actually make a huge difference once you start digging into the self-storage space that makes a property more desirable. So I ended up offering the 1.2 million that the seller was asking, and he agreed, but however, the brother, who was the other owner, had been talking to the New York hedge fund and they had offered a higher amount. So it ended up becoming a bidding war that I eventually won at 1.325 million. And the reason I won is because I looked at the terms that they were wanting. They were wanting a quick, clean sale without much due diligence. The hedge fund in New York, since they had a big hedge fund that had more red tape, needed all these due diligence documents that the seller just didn't have, as he was a mom and pop seller. And they even offered more. They offered 1.4 million. However, they went with my offer even though it was $75,000 lower, just because I didn't need as much due diligence items. I only asked for a rent roll and that was it. The New York buyers wanted a rent roll, profit and loss statement for the last 3 years, a phase 1 environmental study, and all these other things that the seller just didn't really care for and just made it a headache for him. So he'd rather give up some of the money and go with a smoother transaction. The crazy thing is, this whole process of finalizing the contract and negotiating with the seller, I was actually in Tulum, Mexico on vacation when I finalized and signed the contract with the seller. That's the power of real estate and technology, where you can do stuff like this remotely and enjoy your freedom. So once you have the property under contract, the next step is dispositions. You want to sell it or assign it to an end buyer. However, since this was my first self-storage deal, I made a few mistakes in the beginning, and I'm going to explain what I did and how you can avoid them so you can get the best buyer possible. So I went to the regular real estate investment groups on Facebook for the Houston area, and I listed the property for $1.5 million. That was my mistake, as these groups normally cater to single-family investors. A lot of those investors don't understand commercial property and aren't capable of buying them. I did eventually get it under contract, and a buyer flew out to look at the property, but just from some of the questions he was asking, I could tell that he wasn't as experienced, and he had a big issue with the flooding of the property, so he ended up backing out on the property. So I didn't panic though, so I started doing some due diligence and thinking of where I could sell this property. I then found several self-storage specific Facebook groups where I posted the deal, and I was bombarded with inquiries. All you literally have to do is just search self-storage real estate investors on Facebook and just join the groups. I had multiple offers within a few days, and I ended up accepting a cash offer at 1.425 million. I accepted this offer because it was another local investor that I already knew and I knew could perform, and I also said that I would pay the title policy in the transaction. So even though it was a $100,000 assignment fee, I had to pay the title policy, and that lowered the profits a little bit. A few days later, I got an offer at $1.525 million from a strong buyer, but they needed financing. So if I had just waited, or I had more time and I could trust the end buyers, I would have gone with a higher offer. I could have made another $100,000. This could have been a $200,000 deal. However, since I had already had one buyer back out, I went with a safe, sure cash offer that I knew would perform. After selecting a buyer, the process is exactly the same as wholesaling a single family house. The end buyer went out and walked the property. I sent them an assignment contract, which they executed, and I sent that contract to the title company that already had opened the first contract between me and the seller, and then did a wholesale or an assignment of contract to the end buyer. So at closing, I was paid out my assignment fee, the seller got his money, and the buyer took control of the property. Same thing as a normal single family wholesale, just bigger numbers. And as far as contracts go, the contract between me and the seller was just a standard Texas commercial real estate contract, and the contract between me and the end buyer was my standard one-page assignment contract. You don't need any fancy or special contracts if you're just wholesaling a straightforward deal. So just a quick step-by-step recap. I first cold called the tax delinquent list. I negotiated the seller for $1.325 million. I found an end buyer by finding self-storage investing Facebook groups, and the end buyer paid $1.425 million. I had to pay title policy fee out of my assignment contract, and that's how I ended up with a net profit of $93,018. Like I said, it's the same process as single family wholesaling, just bigger numbers. And the whole thing I did was $0 out of my own pocket. If you like this content and you have more questions, comment them down below and subscribe to the channel.